Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Wednesday, August 10th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. We're halfway through the week, and another day closer to the release of the Rings of Power. I hope you're all coping with the excitement in a sane manner, because I'm really not. We've continued to get more promotional material over the last 2 days in the form of posters, and we're going to briefly cover those at the top of the show. Then, we're going to take a different approach and do a deep dive on an area of the show's production that doesn't quite get enough attention: the crew. While we love talking about the cast and the end product, it's important to remember this is all the result of a hard-working team behind the camera. So I'm going to walk us through some of the key individuals we know are working behind the scenes to bring Middle-earth back to our screens. But of course, you all know what comes first. We will begin our episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from The Lord of the Rings, Book 2. The Ring Goes South. At that moment, Elrond came out with Gandalf, and he called the company to him. "This is my last word," he said in a low voice. "The ring-bearer is setting out on the quest of Mount Doom. On him alone is any charge laid, neither to cast away the ring nor to deliver it to any servant of the enemy, nor indeed to let any handle it, save members of the company and the council, and only then in gravest need. The others go with him as free companions, to help him on his way. You may tarry or come back or turn aside into other paths as chance allows. The further you go, the less easy will it be to withdraw. Yet no oath or bond is laid on you to go further than you will, for you do not yet know the strength of your hearts, and you cannot foresee what each may meet upon the road." I chose today's quote because of how often the showrunners have referred to their team as a fellowship, and it's such a perfect metaphor. These incredible productions don't come about as the result of one director or one writer. It's hundreds of hard-working people all together as a team, bringing the scenes that only existed in our mind's eye onto the screen. As I said, we're briefly going to cover the 2 posters released by Amazon. The first is a simple composite poster of Galadriel, standing in a high window overlooking the landscape of Númenor. There's not much to analyse here, but the second poster, well, that's quite the different matter. In the poster released yesterday, we see a beautiful yet haunting scene of Galadriel and Gil-galad standing in front of a carved statue of a figure. Right away, I recognise the figure as Galadriel's brother Finrod. Both his hair and his sword match the footage seen in trailers we discussed yesterday. I love that the elves not only memorialise their fallen kindred from the First Age, but they also carve them into trees as a living memorial rather than the stone statues we've seen from the kingdoms of men. It's also worth noting in the version of the poster released by the Prime Video France account, we can see numerous figures depicted. While we'll probably never get confirmation of who each one depicts, it will surely give us plenty of opportunities to create a headcanon for which elves are memorialised. Also, as pointed out by Non Sequitur Girl on Twitter, it's really interesting to look at the design of the trees in the background, which appear to have been grown so their branches are arched together. This both gives the almost cathedral-like vision of this area, but also reminds us of the arched lattice work we've seen in the architecture, both of Lindon and in the flashback to the image of Tirion in Valinor. Whatever the context of this scene is, I'm very excited to see this theme of memory and grief all brought together in the visual language of the show. Now, moving on to today's main topic, the crew of the Rings of Power. Of course, we must start with the 2 gentlemen at the top, the showrunners, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay. Whilst their resume as showrunners or lead scriptwriters is fairly light, with few credits beyond films like Star Trek Beyond and Jungle Cruise, I do think there's a lot to learn from what they've been saying in the lead up to the show. In every interview I've read or seen, their enduring love and respect for Tolkien shines through. I've been reassured that this pair really understand the themes of the original work, not just the plot or the characters. What's encouraged me most about Payne and McKay is their own approach to how they think about adapting Tolkien's works which don't have a fully fledged narrative, like The Second Age. I do apologise if this next section is very heavy on me reading quotes from the pair, but I do think they put it in better words than I could. Talking about the tonality of Tolkien in Empire magazine, they said, "Some of these other competing properties, they play one octave really beautifully, but Tolkien was playing every note on the piano. He had that variety of tones. So for us, it was about going deeper into what we are, rather than worrying about what other folks were doing." Speaking also on how they approached adapting such an iconic piece of work, "The pressure would drive us insane if we didn't feel like there was a story here that didn't come from us. It comes from a bigger place. It came from Tolkien, and we're just the stewards of it. We trust those ideas so deeply because they're not ours. We're custodians at best." I love this idea of stewardship and think it's really key to any successful adaptation. The creators of an adaptation are not owners of the ideas or the stories, they're simply stewards trying to bring these ideas to a different medium. Reinforcing what today's episode is all about, in Total Film they also talked about the team needed to bring this all together. Tolkien left us this trail of breadcrumbs. We see our skills working with so many amazing talented artists to bring that into fruition and excavate the fossil that he left us. I think whether you believe any adaptation can truly bring the spirit of Tolkien to the screen, it's clear to me that they're taking an approach which is both humble and collaborative, something which I think is very important. I know there's also been repeated concern from the beginning of this process, some of it good faith and some of it not, that the show will somehow be inherently political. Now, whatever I may think of the value of that as a critique, I would hope it would reassure people to hear from the creators in their own words. It was very important that what Tolkien was creating was not an allegory. He was not commenting on historical events of his time or another time. He was not trying to transmit a message that spoke to contemporary politics. He wanted to create a mythos that would be timeless. Every single choice we've made at every turn of making this show has been faithful to that aspiration. We want to be timeless. Whether this show will be timeless is one question, but I think that the fact that the showrunners have set this as a goal is incredibly encouraging. Moving from the showrunners to the directors, the Season 1 directors for the Rings of Power are an interesting mix. Firstly, we have J.A. Bayona, one of my favourite modern directors who has directed the first 2 episodes. Back in June, I did a thread on 2 of my favourite films he's made, The Impossible and A Monster Calls. I would highly recommend both films to everyone. A Monster Calls feels very Tolkienian in its use of stories within stories, as well as its key themes of hope, courage, and dealing with grief. Not to mention, it's hard not to see the titular monster as a wonderful alternative depiction of an Ent. The Impossible, on the other hand, is based on a true story, but is no less a deeply heartfelt story which Bayona manages to keep at the core of the film, despite the vast scale of destruction he's showing. Of course, it should also be mentioned that the film has many visual parallels to Tolkien in its depiction of natural disasters. I've said it before, but I would be highly surprised if Bayona isn't brought back to direct a certain episode which depicts a kingdom's watery demise. Just a guess. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on these 2 films, I highly recommend taking a look at my thread which unpacked several scenes from these films, which I've linked in the episode description. There's also a particularly interesting quote J.A. Bayona gave about the core of the series. Referencing a 7-minute scene which is solely a conversation between Galadriel and Elrond, he said, "Normally when you think about these huge blockbusters, these huge productions, it's more about the set pieces. But doing that scene, I knew it was not about the set pieces. That conversation was what this show is about. Not only am I hugely excited for a 7-minute dialogue scene, yes please, but also it's reassuring to see that the show is focused not on spectacle and set pieces, but on dialogue and story. The spectacle should always be something that is complementary to the story, but not dominate it." As for the other 2 directors, Wayne Yip is directing 4 episodes and Charlotte Brandstrom also directed 2. Yip is a long-standing British television director, and while it's harder to analyse a TV director's style, I will say that the work of his I've seen is very impressive. He's directed classic British sci-fi shows like Misfits and Doctor Who, but has also moved on to direct larger budget streaming shows. Most recently, he directed 2 episodes of the Wheel of Time series. While I haven't read the books and really don't care to dive into an argument about that adaptation, I'll simply say that I thought his direction of episodes 3 and 4 were spectacular, especially the 4th, which was my favourite episode of the series by far. His ability to handle quieter, more emotional moments really impressed me, such as Perrin discussing loss with the Tuatha, and Tom Merrilin telling the story of his nephew's suicide. But so was the tension and drama he built with scenes like the fight with the Fade and the showdown between Logain and the Aes Sedai. That very last scene of the episode is one of my all-time favourites in fantasy television, so I'm very excited to see what Yip brings to the table. Unfortunately, I've not seen much of Brandstrom's work, so I wouldn't want to offer too much commentary, but I did think she did a stellar job of directing episodes 5 and 6 of Season 1 of The Witcher. Despite being a show that seemed to struggle with its production value in Season 1, I thought Brandstrom still achieved some striking visuals, including Yennefer's struggle with the Djinn, alongside some very intimate and emotional scenes between Geralt and Yennefer, and also Geralt and Jaskier in the 6th episode. The writer's room for the Rings of Power seems to be equally filled with a team of smart and talented writers. The most notable name to me was Jennifer Hutchinson, part of the awards-nominated teams on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. Hutchinson even won a Writers Guild of America award for her writing on the Season 5 episode of Breaking Bad, Confessions. Also on the team are Jason Cahill, known for his work on The Sopranos and Halt and Catch Fire, Helen Shang from Hannibal and 13 Reasons Why, Justin Doble, who worked on Stranger Things Seasons 1 and 2, and Stephanie Folsom of Thor Ragnarok and Toy Story 4. In addition, Brian Cogman of Game of Thrones fame was an early consultant on the show, but his involvement beyond initial pre-production was reportedly limited, so we'll have to see if he receives any script credits. I'll say personally that this quality of writer's room, alongside Payne and McKay, fills me with great hope. If this team can bring the sort of introspective depth of Breaking Bad, or the horror and drama of Stranger Things, then we're in for a real treat. On the production and costume design, there will be familiar names to longtime Lord of the Rings fans. Kate Hawley returns to lead the costume design team, having worked on Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy. Whatever one thinks of the Hobbit films in terms of an adaptation, they certainly have some of my favourite costume designs inspired by Tolkien. I hope we see some of the ostentatious beauty of the likes of Thranduil, or that feeling of real lived-in clothing from the people of Lake Town. Similarly, we've known that beloved by fans Weta Workshop was involved in Season 1. In particular, the involvement of Weta in the design of the orcs was something that got fans particularly excited. I've spoken about how much I love the practical and prosthetic effects of the orcs in the Rings of Power before, and would go as far to say I think they're some of the scariest orcs we've ever seen. Jamie Wilson, who headed up the prosthetic department, had a great description of the design approach for the show in the IGN article. The way I described it to my team, it's a bit like these are the baby versions. They're not actually babies, but it's them coming out from the darkness. So this is early on. This is before the next range of big battles. There's a lot more smooth texture. There's still wrinkles and lines and shape and form, but they're not so battle-scarred, but they are dealing with some skin conditions because of their exposure to the sun. I love the level of thought that has gone into details like this, and can't wait to see what else they have in store for us from a creature design perspective. Moving away from characters, Ramsey Avery leads the production design team, having worked on sets as far apart as Guardians of the Galaxy and 10 Cloverfield Lane. I'm already impressed by the set design we've seen so far. Each culture and kingdom has such a distinctive feel and look to it, and you can tell the amount of effort that went into it. He gives a lot of great details in the Entertainment Weekly article, but I think this summarises Avery's whole approach perfectly. Avery vowed to keep even the most fantastic locations grounded, building as many practical sets as possible. We wanted it to feel real and honest, and as present as we possibly could. We wanted to make sure that the actors had a world that felt inhabitable by them. I've heard before from actors how much they value having real sets and environments to work in. I think it will pay off in a huge way for the end product. Beyond the characters and the story, I really can't wait to see these sets. The details that took no doubt hundreds of hours of work from the production team. It's one of my favourite parts of the show already. Finally, makeup artists Jane O'Kane and Vinnie Ashton talked in Total Film about the details that audiences may not even notice, but are there to add depth even beyond the costumes. Speaking about the elves, they said, "We gave them a real ethereal quality. Everything about them was shining and lustrous. We gave their skin a real luster. We even put metallic threads into their hair to give shine and shimmering light, the reflection of light and luminosity being such a big part of their world." Details like this are what demonstrates the level of care the show is taking to reach its desired visual language. Now, there are two big behind-the-scenes areas I haven't touched on this episode: music and language. However, I really want to devote a full episode to Bear McCreary's music, and I'd like to do that once we have a full soundtrack released for the show. I'd also like to maybe devote a whole other episode to languages and the work of dialect coach Laith McPherson, which I think is a really interesting area of the show. But if I tried to fit those into today's episode, we'd be here for hours. So for now, that's all we have time for. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what aspect of the show you're looking forward to, which isn't the story or the portrayal of characters. Do you already have a favourite set or costume? Which Rings of Power crew department would you like to hear from more in an interview? So if you want to continue the conversation, leave me a comment on Twitter. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namaste.